Sarah had always been a night owl. After years in the Air Force, where her sleep schedule was dictated by mission demands and unpredictable hours, she found solace in the quiet of the late evening. It was her time to unwind, a chance to sip a drink, flip through old flight logs, and let her mind wander. Tonight was no different, until the hum started. It was faint at first, like the distant buzz of high-voltage power lines. Her brow furrowed as she set down her glass, straining to pinpoint the sound's source. Within seconds it grew louder, reverberating through her bones. Then, without warning, the entire room was bathed in an unnatural blue light. A surge of weightlessness hit her, and suddenly, she was moving, not stepping, not running, but floating, as if some unseen force had hooked into her very molecules and was pulling her skyward. Her instincts kicked in. She thrashed, reaching for anything solid, but her fingers swiped through empty air. The city lights below blurred as she was yanked through the atmosphere. A split second later, everything went dark. Sarah came to with a gasp, her lungs desperate for air. Cold metal pressed against her back. Blinking rapidly, she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The walls were sleek and curved, panels pulsing with a dull green glow. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't even a military experiment gone wrong. Towering figures stood around her, their reptilian skin glistening under the dim lighting. Broad shoulders, sharp claws, and glowing yellow eyes. She'd seen enough sci-fi movies to know what they looked like: mercenaries. Armed. Dangerous. And not remotely human. A massive alien stepped forward, his frame easily twice her size. The deep scars running down his neck suggested he wasn't the type to negotiate. His voice, guttural and filled with authority, echoed in the chamber. "You are now property of the Corda Syndicate." Sarah exhaled slowly, forcing her heart to steady. The worst thing she could do right now was panic. If these creatures had gone to the trouble of abducting her, it meant they wanted something. That meant she still had leverage. The alien leader studied her, as if gauging her reaction. He finally spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Your knowledge is valuable. You will assist us in matters beyond your primitive world." Sarah bit the inside of her cheek. So they knew about her. At least they knew enough to think she was worth abducting. She had spent the last few years working as an aerospace engineer after leaving the Air Force. It was possible they needed her technical skills, but for what? She squared her shoulders. "And if I refuse?" The leader's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "You won't." Sarah's muscles tensed as she felt the cold restraints around her wrists. The cuffs weren't like any metal she'd encountered before, lightweight but unbreakable. Her mind raced through her options. These creatures had technology beyond anything on Earth, but that didn't make them infallible. She turned her head slightly, taking in the details of the ship's interior. The mercenaries carried weapons, but they moved with a sense of routine, not high alert. That meant they weren't expecting her to fight back. Their mistake. She flexed her hands, testing the cuffs. No give. But they were secured by a single locking mechanism, which was fastened to the chair behind her. She noted a smaller guard lingering near the exit, his stance more relaxed than the others. He wasn't paying close enough attention. Sarah inhaled sharply and yanked her right arm forward with all her strength. Pain shot through her wrist, but she felt the joint slip. She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out as she dislocated her own thumb, just enough to wiggle free. The moment she felt her hand slide through, she acted. With a quick twist, she reached down, grabbed the alien's belt as he passed, and yanked hard. The mercenary stumbled, caught off guard, and she drove her knee into his chest. He crumpled, and Sarah wasted no time grabbing the strange-looking weapon holstered at his side. The door was 10 feet away. She bolted. Alarms blared as she sprinted down the metallic corridor. She didn't know where she was going, but she figured anywhere was better than sitting around waiting to be bartered like cargo. She rounded a corner, only to find herself face to face with the leader himself. His towering frame blocked the entire passage, and his glowing eyes gleamed with something between amusement and admiration. "I admire the effort, human." Sarah raised the stolen weapon, but before she could fire, he was on her. Clawed fingers gripped her arm, twisting it with practiced ease, forcing her to drop the weapon. In one swift motion, he spun her, locking her in a vice-like hold. "Next time," he rumbled, dragging her back toward the cell. "Try a plan that lasts more than 30 seconds. The cuffs snapped back into place around her wrists, this time reinforced with a secondary locking mechanism. Sarah sat back, catching her breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ship's dimly lit chamber felt heavier than before, thick with tension as Sarah sat in the reinforced restraints. She could hear the murmur of alien voices from the corridor beyond, the guttural sounds of a language she didn't understand. Whatever discussion they were having, it was about her. Moments later, the massive alien leader, Kordek, returned, followed by another mercenary carrying a holographic device. The second alien, smaller but with sharp, intelligent eyes, activated the device, projecting a shimmering blue figure into the air. The buyer. Sarah didn't recognize the alien shape hovering in the projection, but she didn't need to. The deep, hissing voice that followed made it clear they weren't negotiating for her release. "She is unremarkable." The voice was slow, deliberate, and vaguely irritated. "You are wasting my time, Kordek." Kordek clenched his jaw. "She has knowledge. Earth's aerospace technology is advancing. She could be useful." The holographic figure made a dismissive sound. "Perhaps. But prove it." A heavy silence settled in the room. Kordek turned his glowing gaze toward Sarah. "Tell them what you know." Sarah held her expression neutral. She had spent years in the military, had been in situations where information was leverage. This was no different. "I'm just an engineer," she said smoothly. "I work with basic atmospheric crafts. Civilian level." Kordek's jaw tensed. "Lies." "I'm flattered, really," she said, leaning back as much as her restraints allowed. "But you might have the wrong person." A low growl rumbled from deep in Kordek's throat. "If you insist on playing games, human, I will show you why that is unwise." He reached for something at his belt, a small, metallic device. Before Sarah could fully process what he was about to do, the smaller alien mercenary, still holding the holographic device, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened as he squinted at the projection. Then, in heavily accented English, he read aloud. "They called her Hellcat?" A ripple of silence fell over the room. The holographic figure stopped speaking. The mercenaries, even Kordek, exchanged uncertain glances. Sarah could feel the shift immediately. The moment that name was spoken, everything changed. One of the mercenaries muttered something in a hushed, reverent tone. Another took an instinctive step back. Sarah raised an eyebrow. She had used the Callsign during her time in the Air Force, but it wasn't exactly legendary. As far as she knew, it had been an internal nickname among her squadron. It had never left Earth. So why did they know it? Kordek's eyes darkened. "Where did you get that name?" The smaller mercenary hesitated, then gestured to the holographic records they had pulled from Earth's databases. "It's here. A designation given to her during the galactic conflict." Galactic conflict? Sarah had never heard that phrase before. Another mercenary spoke, his voice uncertain. "Impossible. The Hellcat was a nightmare in the last war." The words sent a prickle down Sarah's spine. "What war?" A third alien, younger and visibly unsettled, whispered. "I heard stories. A human pilot who wiped out entire squadrons. Took down a Drellic fleet alone." His gaze snapped toward Sarah, eyes full of apprehension. "She wasn't just a pilot. She was death in a cockpit." Sarah remained still, processing. She had flown missions, but nothing on the scale they were describing. The stories were exaggerated, twisted. But she wasn't about to correct them. She smirked. "That's right." She let the confidence seep into her voice. "And you just made the worst mistake of your lives." The tension in the room spiked. Some of the younger mercenaries looked outright terrified now. The atmosphere had shifted from smug control to something else entirely: uncertainty. Kordek's expression was unreadable, but his grip on his belt tightened. That is a bold claim, human. Sarah exhaled slowly, making her next move count. You've heard the stories. Maybe they're exaggerated. Maybe they're not. She let the words hang, playing into the fear. But are you willing to bet your lives that I'm not exactly what they say I am? One of the mercenaries near the door hesitated, his hand twitching toward his weapon. Another murmured something in their native tongue. It was subtle, but Sarah recognized it. Doubt. Kordek stepped forward, lowering his voice. If you are the Hellcat, prove it. Sarah tilted her head slightly. I already did. Kordek frowned. She leaned in as much as she could within her restraints. Think about it. If I weren't who they say I am, why are half your men looking like they'd rather eject themselves into space than be in this room with me? She let her gaze sweep over the uneasy faces. Your mistake wasn't taking me. It was failing to realize what you brought onto your ship. Silence stretched. The ship's engines hummed in the background, a quiet reminder of the vast, inescapable space around them. Then, slowly, one of the mercenaries muttered, We should get rid of her. Another added, If she's the Hellcat, we're already dead men. Kordek shot them both a glare, his patience thinning. But Sarah could see the shift. He wasn't in full control anymore. The weight of the name had cracked something within his crew. She pressed on. You should listen to them. Her voice was calm, controlled. Because if I get out of these restraints, I promise you, the next thing I do will make your nightmares look tame. The youngest mercenary outright took a step back. Another adjusted his weapon nervously. Kordek's expression was unreadable, but his posture had changed. Less dominance, more calculation. Sarah had been trained to recognize battlefield psychology. Fear worked both ways, and right now, she wasn't the one afraid. She smiled. Now, are we going to keep pretending I'm just an engineer? Or are we going to talk about how you plan to survive having me on your ship? Silence clung to the air like a thick fog. The mercenaries were no longer looking at Sarah as a helpless prisoner. They were looking at her as something far worse, an unknown threat sitting in their midst. The weight of the Hellcat legend had sunk in, wrapping around them like chains they couldn't shake. Kordek stood motionless, his reptilian eyes locked onto her. He was trying to decide if he should believe the myth or stick to cold logic. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his head. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize the moment someone started calculating risks versus rewards. This changes nothing, Kordek finally growled. Sarah arched an eyebrow. You sure about that? Because your men don't look like they agree. One of the mercenaries muttered something under his breath. Another took a slow step away from her, as if she might explode at any second. The fear was real. And Sarah wasn't about to waste it. She shifted slightly in her restraints, keeping her voice even. You kidnapped me thinking I was just some aerospace engineer. But if you knew even half of what I'm capable of, you'd realize I don't need weapons or freedom to be dangerous. I just need time. Kordek's jaw tightened. Let me put it this way, she continued, tilting her head slightly. Your ship? I've already mapped its weaknesses. Your guards? I've identified the two most likely to panic under pressure. And if I really wanted to, I could turn half of your crew against you before we even leave this room. A murmur ran through the mercenaries. One of them glanced at Kordek uneasy. Kordek exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience thinning. Enough. Sarah only smiled. If you say so. The moment hung between them, thick with tension. But Sarah had done what she needed to, she had cracked their confidence. They weren't looking at her as just a prisoner anymore. They were looking at her as a problem. And problems, if left unsolved, had a habit of escalating. That was exactly what she was counting on. The ship's atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just a group of hardened mercenaries working under one leader. Now there were factions forming, some loyal to Kordek, others shaken by the Hellcat name. Sarah could see it in their stances, in the way they exchanged glances when they thought no one was looking. One of the younger mercenaries, a wiry figure with nervous energy, leaned toward a fellow crew member and whispered, "If she's really the Hellcat, what the hell are we doing keeping her here?" Another mercenary, older and battle-hardened, crossed his arms. "She's just a human," he grumbled, but the doubt in his voice betrayed him. Sarah smirked inwardly. The fear was spreading faster than she had anticipated. Kordek knew it too. His voice was a sharp bark. "Enough whispering." A few of them snapped to attention, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Sarah decided to water it. "You know," she said casually, "if I were you, I'd be a little worried. If the buyer finds out you kidnapped the Hellcat, do you think they'll be happy about it?" A flicker of hesitation passed through Kordek's expression. Sarah pressed on. "Because if you know my name, that means others do too. And if the stories about me are this big, that means someone out there respects what I can do." She let the words settle. "And if they respect me, they might come looking." That was the breaking point for some of them. One of the mercenaries turned to Kordek. "She's right. This isn't worth the risk." Another, emboldened, muttered, "We should space her before she gets the chance to prove she's the Hellcat." Kordek's hand went to his weapon, and for the first time, Sarah saw real anger in his expression. "Anyone who disobeys me will join her." A heavy silence followed. Sarah knew she had reached the limit. If she pushed too hard now, Kordek would double down to reassert control. That wasn't what she needed. She leaned back against her restraints, her voice almost amused. "You should listen to them, Kordek. They're starting to sound smart." Kordek's gaze burned into her, but he didn't respond. He couldn't, not without losing more of his grip on the crew. That was enough for now. Kordek's patience was hanging by a thread. Sarah could see it in the way his muscles tensed, in the way his hand hovered near his weapon just a little too long before pulling back. He wasn't afraid of her, at least not yet, but he was afraid of losing control. And that was just as dangerous. She decided to push one last button. "You ever wonder why the Hellcat became a legend?" she asked, her voice light but deliberate. Kordek exhaled sharply. "You enjoy hearing yourself speak, don't you?" Sarah shrugged as much as her restraints allowed. "Just making sure you understand what you're dealing with." Kordek stepped closer, leaning in until she could see the intricate scars running across his reptilian skin. "You are not a legend. You are just a human who got lucky in the wrong place at the wrong time." Sarah held his gaze, unflinching. Then, slowly, she smirked. "If you really believe that, then why haven't you killed me yet?" Kordek's jaw tightened. That was all the answer she needed. The ship's alarm system blared, a deep, pulsing warning that echoed through the metallic corridors. Sarah barely had time to register what had happened before she saw one of the mercenaries crumple to the ground, his own blaster slipping from his fingers. The room erupted into chaos. Someone had panicked. She had been counting on that. Before Kordek could react, Sarah twisted sharply, yanking her restraints with everything she had. The reinforced cuffs didn't give way completely, but they loosened, just enough for her to maneuver her arms. The shot that had taken out the mercenary had hit something else, too, a control panel behind Kordek. Sparks showered the chamber as the ship lurched violently to the side. Sarah felt the artificial gravity stutter for a second before re-engaging, a clear sign that something critical had been damaged. Kordek whipped around, his hand on his weapon, scanning the chaos. A few mercenaries had already drawn their own weapons, unsure if they were meant to be fighting each other or dealing with Sarah. She didn't give them the time to figure it out. With a sharp movement, she wrenched her wrist one last time, dislocating her thumb again to slip free. The moment her hand was loose, she lunged for the nearest mercenary's belt, grabbing the small blade strapped to his side. He barely had time to react before she drove an elbow into his ribs, sending him stumbling back. Kordek snarled, "Contain her!" But it was too late for that. Sarah had been trained for high-speed combat, for chaos in tight spaces. The mercenaries were used to taking orders, not reacting to the kind of battlefield improvisation she excelled at. In a matter of seconds, she had used the stolen blade to cut through the final restraint, freeing herself completely. She grabbed the fallen mercenary's blaster and fired without hesitation, hitting a panel near the exit. The door hissed open, and she bolted. Sarah sprinted down the corridor, heart pounding, adrenaline kicking her body into overdrive. Behind her, she could hear Kordek barking orders, the heavy stomping of boots as his crew scrambled to pursue her. She didn't have a plan yet. She just knew she had to get to the hangar. Her best chance was one of their ships. The corridors twisted and turned, but Sarah had already memorized the layout. She had been watching, tracking, cataloging every door and junction since the moment she was taken. A sharp turn, then another. She slid past the maintenance hatch, darting through a narrow service corridor meant for droids. The sound of footsteps behind her grew distant. They weren't used to someone moving like she did. Then she saw it, the entrance to the hangar. Sarah skidded to a stop just as the doors opened, revealing the sprawling space beyond. Rows of small fighters and larger dropships lined the docking bay. And standing in front of them, waiting, was Kordek. He had taken a shortcut. His massive frame blocked the only clear path to an escaped ship. His eyes burned with fury, but there was something else there too, something more dangerous. Respect. He wasn't underestimating her anymore. Sarah tightened her grip on the stolen blaster, keeping her breathing steady. Gotta admit you're persistent, she said. Kordek's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're not the only one who's good at this. She needed a new angle. She could try to fight him, but Kordek was bigger, stronger, and had backup coming. A direct battle wasn't the play here. Instead, she tilted her head, feigning curiosity. You could have let your crew handle this. But you came yourself. Why? Kordek studied her. Because you're worth more alive than dead. She laughed once, sharp and amused. Funny. I was about to say the same thing about you. That got his attention. Sarah took a slow step forward, lowering her weapon slightly. Think about it. I'm a pilot. A damn good one. Your crew is already shaken, and if you hand me over to that buyer, they'll see you as weak. But if you keep me... She let the sentence hang. Kordek's eyes narrowed. You want me to hire you? She smirked. I want you to let me leave. But if you were smart, you'd realize I could be more useful to you than whatever payout you're expecting. The seconds dragged. Behind her, she could hear the distant clatter of approaching boots. Kordek was weighing the options. Sarah saw the flicker of hesitation, so she acted. With a swift motion, she shot at the ground between them, sending up a shower of sparks. It was just enough to make him flinch. In that split second, she spun, lunging for the nearest fighter. Kordek roared in frustration, but she was already moving. Sarah scrambled up the side of the ship, her hands finding every grip point with practiced ease. She dove into the cockpit, fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls. It wasn't exactly like an Earth fighter jet, but flight was flight. And she had always been good at improvising. The engines hummed to life. Kordek lunged for the ship, but Sarah was faster. She punched the thrusters, sending the ship rocketing forward. The hangar alarm shrieked as she blew past the outer doors and into the vast expanse of space. She grinned, gripping the controls with steady hands. Behind her, the mercenaries scrambled to chase. But Sarah had flown in dogfights before, and they had no idea who they were up against. She tapped the comms panel and sent one final transmission back to the ship. Hellcat out. Then, with a sharp turn, she vanished into the stars. The stars stretched endlessly before her, a sea of shimmering light against the black void. Sarah had always loved the sky, but this was something else entirely. The cockpit of the stolen fighter hummed with power beneath her hands, the controls responding as if they had been made just for her. She had escaped. For the first time since being yanked from her apartment, she let herself exhale. Her muscles ached, her adrenaline was still high, but the immediate danger was behind her. Or at least, she hoped it was. She glanced at the navigation screen. The ship was equipped with advanced star charts, most of them mapping systems she had never heard of. That only confirmed what she already suspected. Earth was just a blip on the galactic radar, a backwater planet most species overlooked. And now, she wasn't just from Earth. She was a name whispered in fear. She was the Hellcat. The thought sent a strange feeling through her chest. Back home, she had been a skilled pilot, sure, but she had never been a legend. Now, out here, she had become something more. But there was no going back. If those mercenaries had gotten their hands on her records, that meant other groups could too. If she returned to Earth, she wouldn't just be a target, she'd be bait. She clenched her jaw. No, going home wasn't an option anymore. She was going to have to find another way to survive. As Sarah adjusted the ship's course, the comm panel flickered to life. She frowned, glancing at the screen. An incoming transmission, unfamiliar frequency. She hesitated. It could be the mercenaries trying to track her. Or worse, the buyer they had intended to sell her to. But curiosity won out. She tapped the console, and a deep, distorted voice filled the cabin. Hellcat. We've been looking for you. Sarah sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. Who's we? She asked, keeping her voice steady. A pause. Then a set of coordinates blinked onto the screen. Come and find out. The transmission cut off. Sarah stared at the flashing numbers. She had a choice. She could keep running, disappear into some uncharted system and try to stay ahead of whatever was coming for her. Or she could follow the coordinates and find out just how far her legend had spread. She smirked, fingers tightening around the controls. Hellcat didn't run. She punched in the coordinates and set her course. The ship's engines roared as she accelerated, leaving the past behind her. The hunt had just begun.